Alright, so this is me painting 4 different acrylic forms. We're going to start by using acrylic paper. This is just fit for our sketchbook. You can also do the 4 forms on just one piece of acrylic paper. So I have my matte medium. I mixed a violet for myself. I labeled tint, hue, and shade. And then I have some white. So remember, you can use whatever color you want, but to darken it, you're going to use the complement. So we're not going to use black. So I mixed a violet, which is pretty dark, so I'm going to add some white to this to make the hue, and I'm going to use that pure violet as my shade. You can also make a value scale for you if that helps. Again, you probably should be mixing with a palette knife, but I'm a messy painter and this is just how I do things. When you are mixing though, you want to make sure you don't get a bunch of paint on the ferrule of the brush and just keep it on the bristles. And then usually before I start painting, I kind of keep enough on it so it's not like super gloopy. And then again, in that little container is just some matte medium that I like to mix in to keep it smooth. Sometimes I use water, sometimes I use a combination. But I want to keep it so it flows nicely. And then I'm dabbing off the extra. So to make an edge, I push my brush to the edge and I pull. So I'm not pressing too hard. I push it to the edge and then I pull. Since this is a flat brush, this works good for creating edges. And my edges are not going to be perfect, but they should be pretty good. You also want to make sure you pick a brush that's good for the job and not one that is too big or too small. So this one's just about right for this size. And I like to turn my paper around since I can. I don't like to pull towards my opposite side when I'm painting. So get the edge and then fill it in. And then you are not going to be able to just do one coat usually with acrylic paint. You usually need at least 2 coats. So again, with painting with acrylic, you need to be patient and let it dry, especially if it starts to get tacky. If you start feeling the paint start to pull up as you're painting, that means you need to stop and you need to let it dry. If you have a color on your palette that you know you want to use later, use a spray bottle and just give it a little spritz of water. And it usually will keep it moist enough that you can use it in a little bit. So I'm trying to get that edge right there, and I kind of messed it up. So it's better just to pull and up than try to go sideways with the brush. And I'm not really worried about your perspective or anything on this. This is just about trying to create some form. Alright, so I'm going to be working on my shade. So the shade, I'm just going to use the actual value that I mixed since violet is such a dark shade. I'm going to be using a smaller brush. I'm using a little bit of matte medium in there instead of water. Sometimes I'll use a combination just to get it to flow right. I probably could even have used a smaller brush to do this because it's such a small area. So it is a little bit challenging to paint these smaller forms. So if you want to draw one form on a page and make it bigger, absolutely go for it. And then pushing to the edge, and then I'm just pulling down. Then I like to push to the edge and pull. So I'm going to try to get that angle as good as I can. And then again, especially since this is a dark value, I am going to have to do another layer to make it look completely opaque. Alright, so now I need to let that side dry, and I'm going to work on the top, which is the tint. This is the easiest shape or form, form to work with because there isn't a whole lot of blending on this one. It's just blocks of value. So I'm mixing my tint. Again, if you are a proper painter, you would be using a palette knife. And then I want to make sure I'm not getting a whole bunch of paint up on the ferrule. And then again, I'm just going to block it in. And then you need to be careful if you are putting wet paint next to wet paint because it will unintentionally blend. Alright, so once I finish the top, again, I need to let that dry, and I'm going to be mixing the cast shadow. So now you can see in that little corner, to mix the cast shadow, the opposite of blue-violet is yellow-orange. So I'm going to mix a really dark value for that cast shadow. So usually what happens is it kind of will turn a little greeny on me. So I'm going to go back and add a little bit more blue, and it's ultramarine blue that I'm going to add in there. And then so I'm going to try to create a really nice dark. Again, if I was a proper painter, I would be using a palette knife, but I am who I am. Also, make sure you're using the correct brush for the job. Since my forms are so small, I really wish I would have gotten a smaller brush, but here I am. So you want to make sure that cast shadow is a couple steps darker than your shade side. And then with these dark values, I absolutely have to go over it a second time. So it's going to be a little splotchy that first time around when I paint this. And also my perspective is absolutely not 100% correct. But for this exercise, I'm more worried about creating form and not so much perspective. So just do your best. And then I am adding a little bit of matte medium in there. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of water. And then I like to turn my paper around so I can get that edge. And then I'll also do this with a big painting. I have no problems turning paintings upside down and moving them around so I get the best angle for painting. And then once I am done with this little section, again, I'm going to let it dry. All right, so for this part, I'm just gonna do my second layer because I don't want it to be splotchy. I can see my writing on the tint. I can see that it says tint, and you can see my cat shadow is a little bit splotchy. So with acrylic paint, you're not gonna one-shot anything. You always have to work in layers. So don't get impatient and blob up your paint and hoping you won't have to do a second layer. Just accept the fact that you have to do a second layer. So for the rest of this, I'm just going to speed it up and you can watch me do my second layer. All right, so my second layer is about done. And that looks way nicer than just doing one. So your cube should look something like that. Next, I'm going to work on the cylinder. And in retrospect, I wish I would have drawn this cylinder a little bit bigger. I labeled below mid-tone highlight, mid-tone shadow, mid-tone highlight. I will have some references in class for you to look at, or you can just Google shaded cylinder to get an idea of where all those values will be placed. You can write it out, but I'll have a good reference in class too. So I'm using the same kind of violet, so I'm going to mix a mid-tone. And acrylic paint dries really fast. So with this, I'm going to have to do some wet on wet blending and a little bit of dry brush. So when you are doing wet on wet blending, you want to make sure both layers of paint that you're mixing together are the same amount, have the same amount of moisture in it, or it's going to get tacky, it's going to pull, and then you got to just stop and let it dry. So don't force it. So again, I also wish I would have used a smaller brush or drawn my cylinder a little bit bigger. Don't be afraid of drawing bigger. It's so much easier to paint bigger, in my opinion. So I'm just getting the edges. And then since I have that medium mixed, I'm just going to go to the next stripe of medium. And every artist has different ways of doing this. So if you have your own way that you blend and create light and dark values and form, do it. Acrylic is not my strongest medium, but this is how I start. And again, you can see it's kind of splotchy because remember, we always have to do 2 layers. So right now I'm just kind of just laying the values out in stripes, and then once it's dry, then I go back with a second layer and really start blending. So I'm just going to add all those medium values right now. Alright, so I got some stripes in my medium values, just letting it dry. Especially on this paper, it seems to be drying really fast today. I don't know if it's the lack of humidity in here, because it's winter. But now I'm going to go in and add some of the highlights. So same thing, I'm just going to paint it kind of stripey right now. So I'm just kind of blocking in the values before I really think about blending too much. If I try to start blending before that other value is dry, it's just going to look like garbage and it's going to peel up the paint and it's just going to take me more time. So patience is really important with this. So I have a little bit of dry paint in there, so I'm just kind of going over it, but I'm just going to add in those stripes. All right, so then I'm going to add in my shade. So again, I'm not really worried about blending them right now. I'm just blocking in my values. All right, then last is do the top. I'm just putting a tint on there. If you want to be more realistic, you probably could do a little more value in there. I'm just going by the reference I have. I just want you to be able to generally create something that looks like a form and not a shape. All right, so now I'm gonna try to start blending. So to blend, you wanna have wet paint next to wet paint. And then just the way I like to do it is to do wet paint next to wet paint, and then I kind of will go over it with a clean brush and then blend those two together really lightly, almost like you're petting like a cat, like really gently. So here's my wet paint. I'm going over the wet paint. But to keep it from just being a blobby mess, I will get a clean brush like I am right there and then go over it and kind of just gently, almost like I'm scratching it really lightly. And this just takes practice and time. Sometimes people will do this just with like matte medium. For me, this is a pretty big challenge because it's just so small. And then you could see I got some dark value in there that I'll have to fix. But again, this is just a learning experience. So if it doesn't come out the way you want, let it dry and then keep going. But the key is always to, if it's not working out the way you want and it starts to get tacky, to let it dry. And then you can see I added that shine. That's a little bit of matte medium in there. So I'm just kind of going up and down, and then I'll bring in a brush with no paint, no nothing on it, to blend those two together. But if you're trying to blend smoothly, both of those values need to be wet paint. You can also blend a dry brush on top. It just won't look as smooth. It just kind of depends. And all this comes with practice. So like I said, acrylic is not my strongest medium. So I hope you guys just learn. It just takes practice. And the more I do this, the better I get. The more I teach you guys, the better I get. All right, and then I'm gonna speed up the rest of this cylinder. So just remember, I don't really paint this fast. And don't forget, guys, I at least do 2 layers, so this one is still a little splotchy to me, so I'm gonna do 1 more layer over the top. And then also building up those layers allows those different values to show through. You can thin your paint a little bit more and make those transitions even smoother. So for this one, I'm doing about 3 layers. Alright guys, so there is my cube and there is my cylinder. Alright, so my last 2 forms are my sphere, which I'm going to do a cast shadow with, and then a cone. So the sphere, I'm using a similar blue-violet. Again, you could use whatever color you want, just make sure you are darkening it with the complement. And if you need help with that, always ask. So for the cylinder, I'm going to start by painting it in bands. And again, there is a reference in class. I have a few different references, so I just kind of drew out where my different values are. So remember, it's highlight, mid-tone, shade, you have a reflected light, and then your cast shadow. So I'm using this brush. I could have used a smaller one, probably. And my paint's a little wet. If that's the case, again, you're just gonna have to let it dry. And then you could always, like, see how I'm pulling that mid-tone kind of down pretty low. You can do that and then go over it. Like I said, every artist has a different technique. I like to start with the mid-tones. And then you'll see I'm gonna start going over it with my shade. Or excuse me, my highlight, my bad. And then you can see how that I'm like mixing the paint on the sphere. That's a little more textural way of doing it. Again, as you're doing this, also you need to find your style. Do you work with your paint really dry? Do you like it being chunky? There is absolutely no right or wrong. The goal is to just create a form. And then so I'm going to leave it kind of like chunky like that, and then I'm going to go back and add my shade, which is just my pure value since it's blue violet. And you can see it's kind of streaky. So again, this is definitely at least 2 layers. I'm not just going to do this in 1 layer. And then I'm going to go over the whole thing, and then I'll add that reflected light later. But you can see I do those sweeping motions back and forth to kind of go around how the light would hug the sphere. So then I just need to let this dry. So once it's dried for a little bit, and you can touch it, if the paint comes up, then it's not ready yet. If the paint doesn't come up when you touch it, then it's good. So to mix my cast shadow, it's the same as what I did with the cube. I just added the complement, and this almost looks a little bit too brown for me. So I end up going back and adding a little more blue back in, or violet. But so my cast shadow should be the darkest, and it comes right up underneath. Alright, so now I'm going to be adding in the shade. So you can see, like, just putting another layer on there, how much nicer that looks. And I'm using a less moisture, less medium in my paint, less water. And then I'm just going around, like I'm hugging that sphere. And remember, to make it blend smoother, you want to use wet paint next to wet paint. And then I'll usually come over it with a clean brush to mush the two together. Mush is the official term. So here's my mid-tone, and you can see, like, my palette's always a mess of colors. It's probably not proper to do it that way. But now I'm coming back over with a mid-tone. So since my wet paint's next to wet paint, it's kind of easier to blend it together. And then I'll go back over it with a little bit lighter version. And again, like when I'm mixing paint, it's kind of a mess. And you also want to be careful you don't get too much on your brush. I probably have too much on my brush right there. But again, I'm just going over. Cleaned off my brush because I had too much on my brush. Then mixing a highlight. I don't like to use pure white as a highlight. I'll probably go back over and punch that up a little bit. But so now I have these nice wet values next to each other. So I'm going to go back with that clean brush and start blending. So I put the wet paint next to each other. There's my clean. And then I'm just kind of like, just like I'm petting a cat, like very gentle, because I don't want the cat to bite me. And then I'll wipe it off. So I'm just trying to gently pull those colors together, but in a gradient. I don't want to just make it one value. And this is just, again, it's practice. The biggest thing I want you to get from this is just how to create a form. So maybe your values aren't mixed super smooth. That's fine. We're learning here. And like I've said before, acrylic paint is not my highest skill set. When I was in college, I did way more oil paint, and then I'm a lot more proficient at watercolor. So this is a lot different. And then you could see how I'm taking that clean brush and I'm just lightly, I'm almost just barely touching the surface. So it just kind of blends it, but I'm keeping those distinct values. And then you want at least 2 layers on the sphere, if not 3, to go back over and punch things up or down depending on the value. And so I'm kind of adding a little more to my cast shadow, and then at the end I kind of lighten it because it's darkest, remember, right under that sphere. So I'm adding a little more violet back into it too because I feel like it's a little more brown. And then the darkest portion, and then I go back in and add my little reflected light. Alright, so this is 2 layers of Let It Dry. And I'm going to go back over it with one more, still a little streaky for my taste. So I'm just going to do one more layer. That's probably way too big of a brush that I picked. But one more layer of my shade. Then I'm going to go back with my mid-tone. And it's just the same process. So I'm going to lay down the wet paint. Then I'm going to get my clean brush and kind of just gently mush it together. So I still have the separate values, but where the values meet, I'm trying to create that gradation, just like you were shading in a pencil. All right, just about done. All right, there's my shaded sphere. So it's pretty decent, I think. All right, now the cone. Oof, the cone. The cone is the kind of the hardest for me, because you want to keep that clean edge. The best way to keep that clean edge is also to paint a background, which I'm not making you guys do on here, but if you want to paint a background, you absolutely could. But I'm starting out the same way as I did with the cylinder. So you can see I labeled mid-tone, highlight, mid-tone, shade underneath it. Again, I will have an example for you to look at in class. You don't have to make that up. You can also Google shaded cone example. But again, I'll have a couple examples for you for reference. For this one, I ended up just mixing a black. So my mid-tone is kind of this mid-gray. And the most challenging part with the cone is because that tip gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So you kind of have to play around with it not being too thick. So this is where you want to pick the appropriate brush size. So again, I could have picked something smaller, or ideally I would have drawn my cone a little bit bigger. You can draw these vertical like I did on the paper. You could also draw them horizontally if that helps drawing them a little bigger. But we're working on this paper so it fits in your sketchbook. So I'm going through just like with the cylinder, and I'm just going to lay down stripes of the midtones. Then I'm going to lay down stripes of the highlights, and then the stripe of the shade. Alright, so you can see it's really hard to kind of get the top of that cone with that brush I'm using. So I'm doing my second layer. I got a little wet paint next to wet paint, but it's the same process. I'll go get a clean brush and then go over it to blend. You can also thin the paint with the matte medium and just do a glaze over the top, so like a thin layer of translucent over the top. That is another method. But you want to do minimum 2 layers, at least 3. And you're trying to make it so there's not a definite line between each of the values. It should fade into the next value. So look at the examples I have in class as well. So I let it dry, especially because I was getting a little frustrated with this one. So I'm going back in with my highlight. And it's hard to get a clean edge. If you want to cheat, you could use painter's tape. You could also paint a background on it. And then so I'm just kind of messing with it, adding a little more dark value. Then I just continue to go around adding another layer, and then I use clean brush to blend 2 different values of wet paint. And then you can use some value on your brush, but what'll happen is it'll be a little more stark contrast. So I kind of go back and forth, and it's hard to do that with such a small little cone. If I had 2 big areas of paint, it would be easier. So you can see I'm going back with that clean brush and kind of blending it together, just barely scratching the surface. All right, and then as I do this second layer, I'm going to let it dry, and then I'll do my last layer. Alright, so you can see my cone. It's not perfectly blended the way I want. My lines aren't really as sharp as I would want. They're a little bit wobbly. But again, I kind of struggle painting these things that are a little bit smaller, but just do your best. So I'm going to do my third layer. If your cone's a little wobbly, that's fine too. But adding the wet paint, and then clean brush to blend. And again, I could have used some painter's tape on the edges if I wanted to cheat to get a really crisp edge. You can also add a cast shadow in there to make it look even more 3D. But the cone, I think, is one of the hardest ones because you are shading at an angle versus a cylinder where you're just kind of up and down. So just do your best and create a 3D form. Alright, so I'm going to add the finishing touches. Not perfect, but not too bad. I can't wait to see what you guys did. Make sure you check off with me. Good job.